It's really easy and really normal to gravitate towards using data and statistics in our social impact comms over storytelling. And maybe it's because we see peers doing that, or maybe it's how we've always done it or how our organization has always done it. Maybe it's because storytelling feels really personal or really out there, and just sticking to the hard facts feels more safe or more professional. But here's the thing: people remember stories 22 times better than facts alone. So, in this episode, we're going to explore the why, when, and where of using storytelling so you can leverage this tool to drive your mission forward. Hey, I'm Tanya Bhattacharya, and you are listening to the Campfire Circle podcast. We are all about breaking down the boardroom table as the ultimate space of leadership, and instead replacing it with a campfire, because that's where we share our stories. That's where we build warm community, and that is where there's always room. I'm building an impactful business in public through thought leadership, and I'm taking you behind the scenes all along the way. So if you want to stand out as you stand up for your mission, you are in the right place. So why is the storytelling important in the first place? To answer that, I want you to think back to the last big event, the last big advocacy event or the last big fundraiser that you attended. And I want you to think back, and I want to know if you remember all the facts and the figures that were presented, or not even all of them, but can you remember some of them? I don't know if you can or can't, but I would guess that you remember at least one story. And so I say that because Dan and Chip Heath did an experiment at Stanford, and they invited students to prepare a 1-minute speech about crime. And on average, the students used almost 3 statistics in their 1-minute speech, but only 1 in 10 students told a story at all. And then 10 minutes later, after the speech, 5% of the people in the audience remembered the statistics that were shared. That's not a lot of people, right? Only 5%. But 63% of attendees remembered the stories that were shared. And so that's important, right? I want you to think about a piece of communications that you're working on right now. Maybe it's an annual report for your nonprofit. Maybe it's a white paper for your consulting firm. Maybe it's a speech or like some kind of presentation about your grantee partners at your upcoming foundation event. And I want you to look through it, and I want you to just kind of think to yourself, okay, what is the ratio of data and statistics versus the amount of storytelling that's on there? There's a place for data and statistics, of course, but I would argue that almost all of us could probably infuse more storytelling into our communications work. And so one example of this is earlier this year, I went to Japan. It was like my 4th time in Japan. But this time I went to Okinawa and I visited the Peace Memorial and the museum there that talks about the battle that was fought there during World War II. And I'm not really confident in my memory of the facts and the figures and the specific details. Like, I do not remember those numbers at all. But what I will never forget is there was a room where we could listen to eyewitness testimonies and audio stories. We could put on headphones and listen to people actually sharing their testimony, like sharing their story of what they went through. And all of it came together with a through line about really working for peace. Right. And it was those stories that sticks with you, right? It's our stories that attract other people to us because they see themselves reflected somehow. They begin to buy into your shared vision. They're like a portal to connection. And in the case that I shared just now, these stories helped a future generation, in this case, like my generation, like people now today, learn the lessons from the past, But in many of your cases, the stories that you share are going to help your audience imagine a future that is dreamy, that is just, but they can't necessarily see it yet. They don't really even know what that's going to be like. It's those stories that help connect them to that. Because stories break the illusion that we're all separate, when in reality, we're all interconnected. We want the same things, even through time and space. And so when we share stories, whether it's one-on-one and in person with like a family member of a person we're serving at our organization, whether we're sharing them at the podium in front of a group of electeds or in a written case for support, the funder, those stories aren't really about us. They're not really even about our organization. I mean, they are, but they're bigger than that. The stories are really meant to reinforce an audience member's worldview about the kind of person that they want to be and the kind of world that they want to live in. And that's because I think it's because storytelling is actually one of our most potent survival skills as humans. Humans are kind of weak. Like we don't have as many physical evolutionary advantages. We don't have big teeth. We don't have sharp claws. We don't have big bodies like bears, but we have adapted storytelling. And that's gotten us to where we are now, right? Because they've helped us solve problems and create a better world for ourselves. And this is ancient. Like this is not new. I mean, cavemen told stories. It's in our human makeup to be wired and to empathize and be persuaded by stories. Because before we worked on annual reports and scripts and emails and podcasts and LinkedIn content, right? Stories have always been how we've passed on information from one person to another, one generation to another, one, group to another. And so, one of the things that I often say is that as long as we are talking to the right community, it's rarely that we are asking for too much. It's just that we haven't told the right story enough times, like the stories that really share the message behind what you're trying to create, that why behind it. More on that in terms of when do we use storytelling as an advocacy tool? And I would say that storytelling is especially powerful for those of us who work in social impact because we are all working on issues that are kind of shrouded in stigma. And if you're working on something that is misunderstood, that there's any level of misunderstanding or stigma around, I would argue that storytelling and comms in general, it's not just a department in your organization, it's actually a very vital part of your mission. Because marketing, communication, storytelling, all that kind of stuff is what will actually change hearts and minds to get people into a place where they are willing to listen and then willing to get into action. And so one of the examples that we can look back into in somewhat recent history and really demonstrably see how storytelling changed the tide of this issue is when the abortion ban was overturned in Ireland in 2018, because stories really turned the tide of public opinion. People came out in overwhelming numbers to vote on the repeal of the abortion ban in Ireland. And after the vote happened, 39% of the people who were polled about what changed their mind to a yes on overturning the ban on abortion pointed to a conversation with family or friends or someone in their life where they learned more about their lived experience and their abortion story. And this wasn't just by accident, right? This wasn't just happenstance. This was actually part of a grassroots campaign where thousands of people with some lived experience around abortion actively made the decision to break their silence and inspire other people to, get to the polls, to change their minds on how they were going to vote, and also to speak up. Groups partnered with the Minister of Health and other influential, credible agencies to pledge to have conversations with people around them. They created conversation cafes where people could come and hear from people and hear people's stories. People had badges where they could wear them out into the world, and the badges said, "Talk to me about repeal." There were conversation trainings, opportunities to practice people's stories. There were messaging templates that they could use on social media to start a conversation with someone they hadn't talked to in a while, to ask them to get out and vote. And so in addition to all of these individual volunteers sharing their personal stories, individually, there was also a effort to really tie all of these stories into a unified front. There was a through line of tying their stories into this larger vision where everyone had the freedom to decide whether and when to become a parent. And I just think this is such an interesting case study, and it's extremely relevant now, today, still. And so if you want to learn more about this moment, about reproductive rights in Ireland and how narrative change really turned the tide on it, I'm actually going to link to a journal article about that work in the show notes so you can read more specifically about it. One of the reasons that I think is so interesting is because the issue was really previously just unspoken about, like it was totally stigmatized. And stories was a huge part of what changed that in a relatively short period of time. And part of why I think that is because I think it's really hard to argue against someone's lived experience. It's kind of weird and strange and ironic, but people disregard facts and figures all the time, like real verifiable facts. If those facts, those stats, if that data, if it doesn't fit into someone's web of understanding that makes up their worldview, it's very easy to just say, like, no, that's not real. But someone's story that they're sitting in front of you and vulnerably sharing with you, or even if they're not sitting in front of you, like it's a lot harder to just bat that away and say, that's fake. Like that didn't really happen to you. Because by the time you're engaging with someone's story, you're witnessing someone's humanity. You are having a shared experience. You are connected. And so I think that is part of why storytelling is just such a powerful tool, right? And so those of you who have been working in social impact comms for a while are probably familiar with a practice that has been developed by Marshall Gans called public narrative. It has been used in a lot of different places by a lot of incredible change makers. You know, Obama is one, you know, folks at the grassroots level, folks at the grass tops level. But really, you know, there are three stories that he really suggests that we practice that and have and really share with others and really grow into, because these three stories help you motivate others to join you in some kind of an action, right? They inspire and galvanize people to like do something on behalf of a shared vision or a shared purpose. And so there's the story of self. That's a personal story. And Gans says, you know, this really shows why you are called to what you have been called to. You know, everyone has a story about an experience that got them involved in a given cause. You know, when I invite people onto my podcast to have a conversation, the first question I always ask them is, tell me the story of what you have grown through to become the guide you are today. So we all have a story of self. And so many of us working in social impact comms are really good at talking about the story of our organization, or maybe our like founding story, or maybe like a go-to story that is from a person that you served or a client. And that's all good. Like those are all great stories too. But I really want to encourage you to take some time and think about your story of self if you have not yet had the opportunity to do that. There's the story of us, which is a collective story that really illustrates that shared purpose, the goals, the vision of a community or an organization. And then a story of now is about the challenge that the community that you stand for, your niche, the people you serve, the challenge that they now face, the choices that it must make, and the hope to which we can aspire to. So that's directly from Gans himself. There's always some challenge. There's always some opportunity. There's always something you're working towards. If there wasn't, you know, our work would cease to exist. And actually, that's probably the long-term goal, right? We're always kind of working to transform society enough to the point where like our work, we don't have to do our work anymore, and we can go and, you know, frolic in the field and paint and take naps. But until then, we all have a mission. We all have a social impact mission we're working towards. And so what are you raising funds for specifically right now, and why is it relevant, right? And how can you paint that story? And one of the things he also says is this is a process. Like this is not necessarily a script that you follow and just have forever. Like this changes and evolves over time. It's like a living, breathing thing that grows as you grow, right? And I also just want to say that you can't get it wrong. Like I say this all the time because I think that it can feel a little intimidating, but as long as you're showing up, as long as you're trying, as long as you're coming from the heart and sharing from your humanity, it works. It's powerful, right? Okay, so finally, once you have some stories, or once at least you're committed to sharing more stories, where do you pop them in? Like, where do you weave them into in terms of your overall comms? So there's a lot of different places. I mean, the first thing is, you know, when you go to a gathering, like a luncheon, right? And they pass around a mic for everyone to talk for 30 seconds and just say a little bit about what you do. That is a prime opportunity to share a story. Not just your name, not just your title, because people forget that. Your title is not necessarily relevant to them. But if you share a brief sort of 1 to 2 sentence story, about the work you do, about why you do the work that you do, about, the vision, that is something that people can latch on to. It's going to be different. Like you're going to stand out a little bit, which is not always something that's exciting to people. Like you don't want to be the person who's doing something different necessarily because it feels strange, right? If it goes against our nature, but you're going to be memorable and it's going to support your work, right? It's going to pique people's interest. It's going to make them want to come up to you afterwards and start a conversation. So, I'll leave that with you to consider. Second, stories are great in conversations with family members, with elected officials, with people who disagree. There are opportunities to change hearts and minds everywhere. So back in 2009, when I first entered the nonprofit world, I was working on addiction treatment and recovery, specifically for moms and parenting women. And I remember going to a local community organization, like a group of volunteers, to do a little talk about our work. And people were like, well, why don't they just stop using drugs? And I think it's, there's data I could share, but I think it's the stories of the people who really, really tried and just could not, right? I think those are the stories and the pieces that can shift previously hardwired opinions much more so than statistics. Third, your LinkedIn About section. Of course, I'm going to talk about LinkedIn. Your personal profile. Something I say all the time is that people's LinkedIn so often read as a resume. And when you incorporate your story, it helps to serve as a resource. And this is also something that you can encourage your board members to do, or your, different committee members, your ambassadors, your advocates to do. Add a few sentences to their LinkedIn profile or, anything that they're doing on behalf of your organization to incorporate the story of why they chose to be involved with your mission. That is a huge connector, a huge, connecting force for folks. Fourth, your About Us page on your website. You probably right now have people's pictures, a title, maybe a brief bio. I challenge you or invite you to incorporate a little story, like their little story of self there. The About page is one of the most visited pages on your website. So I really want you to activate the power of storytelling there. And then, honestly, like everywhere, when you're interviewed for a podcast, when you're doing a presentation, when you are on a panel introducing yourself, start with your story, right? And maybe it doesn't always have to be your story per se, but a story that reflects the change that you're wanting to inspire in the person who is listening to that podcast, to that presentation, to that panel, appeal letters, campaign materials, social media posts. Any campaign you're doing could use more stories. Just remember that study I mentioned earlier. Shortly after a talk, only 5% of people remember the statistics that are shared, but 63% of people remembered the stories. Stories are sticky. So as we close out, I really want you to think about a project you're currently working on. And I want you to take a couple minutes, take a closer look at it, and ask yourself if you can infuse more storytelling into it to really inspire your audience towards action. And if you want an accountability partner, reach out to me on LinkedIn, send me a message, let me know what you're working on. I'm always here to cheer you on as you build your own campfire to share your stories and build community and spark that new dreamy vision that you're so passionate about. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, so you've heard from us. Now I want to hear from you. Leaving a review helps us so much in growing our reach and supporting more folks with this podcast. And even better, I would love for you to send me a note on LinkedIn with your takeaways from this episode. I cherish and respond to every message, so I can't wait to hear from you. And if you want to go even deeper, check out the show notes to take your next step.